All right, so let's talk about chapter 6. So in this chapter, we're looking at the design challenge. And this challenge is kind of coming into a position where we rectify what we want as a designer versus what our users need. So what we learn is that good design is an evolving process. And this process is iterative. You test, you find problems, you modify, and you repeat. And this process repeats essentially until the end of time. It repeats until all your resources run out. That's why I like to say that a design is living. When it comes to the design process itself never really stops. It just kind of evolves and moves forward. You're always testing, you're always finding problems, you're always modifying, and then at the end of that, you start over. And really what we find in this process is that we are basically at the end of a tug of war, or just, a regular war. And this war occurs between usability and aesthetics. So making something usable versus making something pretty. And then we have problems occurring when one dominates over the other. Because even though, we talk a lot about usability and making something usable, aesthetics are still important. Because aesthetics are just as important to solving certain problems. Things like interest. When you're trying to solve the problem of interest, you have to have a nice looking site. A boring site that's very usable is not going to keep people interested. So this is a constant battle that we kind of have with ourselves. But what we have to realize here is that we have to step out of ourselves to kind of figure out how this battle ends. You see, designers in general, we have vision problems. We have to realize that we're not the end users. And that we're just making things for other people to use. So the designers themselves, we're not the end users. The clients that might come to us wanting a website made for their business or something of that nature, they're not the end users. The end users are the other people out there that are going to be using this site for a purpose. And as such, we as designers have a hard time conceiving of all the possible ways that people will use things. Because there are a myriad of ways out there that aren't us, because they aren't in our head. And so as we have these problems and as we're having this war, we have these two temptations, these deadly temptations that creep into our work. Creeping featureism, which means that we keep adding useless features until it becomes too difficult to use. And the worshiping of false images. And that's when we take something and we make it look cool, but in the process make it more complicated. So if we have a user interface and we want to make it look neat, so we kind of overdo some aesthetics with it and let the aesthetics dominate the usability just because it looks cool. That's the worshiping of false images in this context. And so Norman calls them deadly temptations. I like to call them something similar when I'm talking about them. I like to call them poison apples. And the real difference here is that, it's both a deadly temptation, just a little more descriptive. Because it all depends on who we're trying to feed here, right? We're creating these things with creeping futurism and the worshipping of false images, and we're making these poison apples. And then by doing that, either we're eating them ourselves or we're feeding them to our users. And so we end up making something that is overly complicated or useless, and we lose a job with a client because they actually have some sense. Or something like this actually gets out into public and we give it to our users and we lose them, and all of the money that would come with them, such as it is. You don't really like to talk about it, but design is a job. Web design is business. So if we're putting out sites with poison apples and we're feeding them to our users and they're eating them and they don't come back. So really there's no perfect solution to all of this. It's design, it's trade-off, it's compromise. So what we in turn have to do is we have to take all of the options and come up with the best solution that we can. One of the things that Don Norman talks about is the invisible computer. And the invisible computer is something interesting, and Norman actually wrote a whole book on the concept of the invisible computer. And you might have heard stuff similar before, and I'd encourage you to read the Invisible Computer book if you have some extra time and want to read a good book. It's available on Amazon. But essentially, what we're talking about when we're talking about the invisible computer is we're talking about the evolution of technology and how things change, and how things could and should change for the better. With the invisible computer, we do tasks. The computer is just kind of there. We're not using the computer per se. We're just completing a task on the computer. And Norman posits that the invisible computer and how we use the computer is really an evolution of how we think about technology in general. Because in the past, the way things have kind of worked is that technology kind of proposes things. Then science studies things, or maybe they do, or maybe they don't, or maybe it's maybe nobody studies it, but technology just kind of proposes things, and then people conform to the technology. But what Norman is proposing with the invisible computer is the opposite. He's saying what should be is that people should propose things. So this is the human-centered idea around technology. People propose, science studies, and then technology conforms. So we figure out what our users want. We do studies to determine how to make that happen. And then we take our technology and we make that happen. Instead of just making technology and expecting people to conform to it. Because in this case, the computer is transparent. If people are proposing how things should work, then the computer itself is just a medium through which you do an action. It's not the thing that you're using in order to enable this. It's because, sometimes the computer in and of itself presents its own level of challenges in designing something for a user. So we're taking technology in and of itself and flipping it on its ear. Because so often we say, well, we'll put out this product and we'll see if people like it. And that's the end. But if we start with the human element, if we start with people, human-centered design, study what we learn, and then build technology, build the things that we want to build out of that, that's when we have something that's effortless. If you do everything right, people won't be able to tell you did anything at all. So that's the end of this video on Chapter 6. We have one more video in this series. You're almost done with this book. Thank you for watching.